Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to take a stack of, well, pretty challenging sources, synthesize the knowledge, and deliver the core insights straight to you. Today, we are peering into the high-stakes, really rarefied air where massive entrepreneurial wealth collides head-on with the ultimate authority of the state. We are talking about the conditional billionaire.
That's exactly right.
Mhm.
Our source material really pushed us to look at the sort of life cycle of these business titans, the ones who operate in systems where the government isn't just a regulator.
Yeah.
No, it's the ultimate absolute authority.
Right.
So we're analyzing these universal, sometimes frankly chilling patterns. You see them across Russia, China, Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
This isn't really about one specific person.
Yeah.
It's more about the playbook the state uses,
Yeah.
how it permits, then accelerates, and ultimately, if it needs to, politically absorbs private power.
Yeah, so our mission today is to try and extract those unwritten rules. The sometimes terrifying rules for how to thrive, yes, but maybe more importantly, how to survive as a billionaire when the state's okay with you, but only conditionally. We'll pull specific examples from our documents, looking at everything from, explosive growth and deliberate regulatory blind spots, right through to strategic, sometimes violent state retaliation.
Yeah, it's quite a range.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Maybe start where these empires begin. The conditions that let them grow so incredibly fast in the first place. Let's focus first on, say, the high-speed engine of Asian tech. #HerHigh. The explosive growth and state infrastructure of tech titans.
Well, the speed of tech growth, particularly in urban China over, say, the last decade or so, it's almost unprecedented. Our sources really document this. The rapid adoption of new internet models, mobile models.
Yeah.
It created this massive boom. It removed friction, kind of took the edge off urban life, as one source put it.
Yeah.
And this was often fueled by really intense subsidy-driven warfare between competing startups, just throwing money at growth.
Which created an environment our sources actually describe as gladiatorial competition. I think that phrase really captures it, doesn't it? The intense winner-take-all nature of these battles. And it produced these enormous valuations, seemingly overnight. I mean, just look at the scale. Meituan Dianping, the services platform, it hit a, $30 billion valuation by late 2017.
Yeah, staggering. And Didi Chuxing, the ride-hailing service, even bigger. $57.6 billion.
Yeah.
That actually surpassed the global valuation of Uber itself.
The very company they were kind of modeled after. Incredible.
But, the sources are also quick to flag the incredible volatility in that scale. It wasn't all smooth sailing. Many of the companies in that online to offline space, the O2O segment.
Right, linking digital services to real-world stuff like food delivery or rides.
Exactly. Many of them collapsed really quickly. Once that initial VC money, those corporate subsidies, once they dried up, poof, only the really strategically dominant ones survived, the ones who truly embedded themselves into the urban fabric.
And this rapid, maybe sometimes shaky growth, it leads us right to a fundamental difference in this ecosystem, doesn't it? The government isn't just facilitating things passively. The sources suggest the state actively functions as a kind of utility itself, an accelerator. It's turbocharging this growth.
Absolutely. The sources argue quite strongly that corporate giants in this sphere, they just can't achieve this massive scale purely through private effort. It demands an accommodating policy environment.
Right.
And often direct government support. The state provides the big picture, the macro vision. We see this very clearly with China's big sweeping blueprint for AI leadership. It basically mandates rapid adoption across the board.
And that plan isn't just wishful thinking, is it? It comes with teeth.
Oh, yeah. Massive new funding, subsidies specifically for AI startups, really generous government contracts, all designed to speed up adoption across practically every economic sector.
Okay, here's where it gets, I think, really interesting for anyone watching the future of technology. The sources flag something they see as genuinely worrisome. These corporate giants are described as working to build the foundational power grids for the AI age. What does that mean exactly?
It means they're building these vast, privately controlled computing networks that distribute machine learning, advanced data analysis across the whole economy. They're essentially acting as these high-tech, indispensable, but private utilities.
Wow. Private utilities for AI.
Yes, and the dynamic is, well, it's fascinatingly complex. Because while these firms are private, by building this national-scale tech infrastructure, payments, logistics, data analysis, you name it, they are at the same time providing the government with incredibly powerful centralized tools for digital surveillance and economic control.
Ah, I see. So the state needs their speed and sophistication.
Exactly. The private tech giants deliver it, often much faster than Government bureaucracy probably could. So it's a strategic win for the state in that sense. But, and this is the flag from the sources, it fundamentally warps the sort of open nature of the technology ecosystem we might be used to elsewhere.
Okay, so to really grasp how deeply this system of conditional power runs, we probably need to look back, right? Past the fiber optics to the sort of historical bedrock of Asian finance. Because this pattern state accommodation paving the way for huge private wealth, it's much older than the tech boom, isn't it? It's rooted in what our sources call the godfather empires of Southeast Asia and Hong Kong.
That historical link is absolutely vital. It establishes this persistent method of control. The sources really emphasize that in a place like Hong Kong, for example. It almost didn't matter who was officially in charge, the British colonial administration, the Japanese during the occupation, or now Chinese communism. The economic and political elite, the ruling group, has largely stayed the same.
Continuity.
Yeah, and a historical reluctance, as one source puts it, for this established elite to undergo any kind of moral epiphany about, sharing governance more broadly.
And crucially, this system was cemented by the power of certain financial institutions, right? Acting almost as literal kingmakers, not just lenders.
Precisely. You look at the role of the Hong Kong Bank. It essentially handpicked and catapulted giants like YK Pao and KS Lai into the stratosphere, way above their established peers at the time.
Okay, tell us more about Pao. His rise is described as a lesson in leveraging state generosity.
Yeah, Pao's story is incredible. Our sources note he had a banker's mind. He was apparently less focused on the nuts and bolts of maritime logistics and more on the financial engineering behind it all. And he was able to, quote, exploit a government's generosity in a way few others could see or manage.
Okay, explain that mechanism. How did he use government generosity to build what became the world's largest shipping empire?
Well, Pao spotted this huge opportunity in the Japanese government's export credits program after World War II. This mechanism basically allowed him to finance a staggering 80% of his new ship costs, all guaranteed by Japanese banks.
80% guaranteed. Wow.
Exactly. And the key was, because Powell immediately secured long-term charters for these brand new vessels, often 15 to 20 years out.
Locking in the revenue?
Precisely. Those contracts themselves provided guaranteed cash flow and minimized his risk dramatically. The whole system, politically and financially, was almost structured to ensure his success. Not necessarily because he was the best ship captain, but because he was the best financial navigator of these state-backed opportunities.
So whether the commodity is shipping capacity and bank guarantees back in the 60s or these massive AI data grids in the 2020s, the blueprint feels kind of similar. The state facilitates the wealth, which means the wealth is inherently conditional.
That's the core idea.
Which brings us perfectly, I think, to the unwritten rules of survival in this environment. Right, here's maybe the most sensitive part of the source material we looked at. How the regulatory system itself seems to actively look away, but only for the elite. In many Asian markets, the sources reveal it's not always about a lack of laws on the books. Sometimes it's the failure by politicians to enforce the existing norms that's far more important.
Yeah, it's the intentional conditional exemption that allows these godfather figures to thrive.
And the career of Li Ka-shing in Hong Kong is presented as a prime case study in this kind of personalized regulatory forbearance.
Exactly. Forbearance is a good word. Our sources document his long history, marked by what they call a long series of often inexplicable exemptions from standard stock market rules. And these are rules specifically designed to protect minority shareholders, ensure fair markets, the basics.
We really need to get into the specifics of these exemptions because they illustrate the system so clearly. We're talking about critical rules that just seem to evaporate if you're powerful enough.
That's right. One really key example detailed in the sources revolves around the 35% ownership trigger. Now, normally, if a shareholder's stake in a public company goes over 35%, they have to make a mandatory general offer.
To buy out all the other shareholders, right? For fairness.
Exactly. Protects the little guy. But in 1985, when Li Ka-shing's company, Hutchison, took over Hong Kong Electric, he crossed that trigger. But he was exempted from making the general offer.
Okay, that's already a pretty major bending of the rules.
It is. But it gets even more pointed later when he increased his stake in another one of his companies, Chongqing, above that same 35% threshold. This time, the Stock Exchange's Takeover Committee, the supposedly independent body whose job it is to uphold these rules, they actually refused the exemption. They said no.
So the system tried to work.
For a moment. And this is the critical point that illustrates the conditional nature of power. The sources revealed that Hong Kong's financial secretary, who is a political appointee, had to personally step in. He contradicted the independent committee, overruled their decision, and granted Li Ka-shing the exemption anyway.
Wow. So the political level overrides the regulatory level when needed.
That sent an absolutely undeniable signal to the entire market, didn't it? The rules exist, sure, but only at the pleasure of the highest political powers. And they will be suspended for the financial elite if it's deemed politically necessary.
And the Tom.com IPO, that's cited as maybe an even more blatant example.
Arguably, yes.
Yeah.
Our sources detailed two really extraordinary exemptions granted there. First, Tom.com was allowed to issue new shares within just 6 months of its IPO. That's a clear violation of the standard lockup period.
Okay. And the second?
Second, major shareholders were permitted to sell down their own stakes after only 6 months, instead of the statutory 2 years. Again, a huge benefit. The sources state it pretty bluntly. Stock market regulations in Hong Kong often appear simply not to apply to the major godfathers.
So it's not lawless, exactly. It's that the application of the law is highly personalized, conditional.
Yes, and that conditionality, that feature, ensures the elites stay dependent on political favor. You don't rock the boat that grants you these privileges.
But that accommodation is temporary, isn't it? It depends on the political climate. Which brings us to the, frankly, terrifying logical extension of this principle. We see it vividly in the Russian context described in the sources. The immediate and sometimes violent suppression of any perceived rival power.
This is the ultimate stark lesson the state can impart when it feels challenged. The sources present the case of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, owner of the oil giant Yukos, once Russia's richest man. His fate is positioned as a definitive, unmissable warning shot to everyone else.
And the trial itself sounds like it was pure political theater.
Pretty much. Described as a foregone conclusion. The sources say it was riddled with procedural violations, harassment of lawyers, reminiscent of the worst show trials of the Soviet era, frankly. The facade of law was sort of maintained, but the political outcome, that was predetermined.
And the speed of the asset seizure. Yugonsneftegaz, Yukos's crown jewel, taken just 5 days after the trial opened. That's not legal due process.
No, it's a declaration of absolute power. 5 days before Khodorkovsky was even convicted of anything.
Before conviction.
Yes. The state was demonstrating in the clearest possible terms that its economic and political priorities absolutely superseded any legal rights of private capital. They were punishing the challenge itself, not waiting for a legal verdict.
And the psychological ripple effect on other oligarchs, other industrialists, must have been immediate.
Oh, completely effective. We see this documented in the sources through the actions of Arkady Volsky. He was head of the main industrialists union at the time. He actually admitted on television, on TV, that he was simply scared to name the powerful figures he believed were behind the Yukos affair. And he explicitly cited his 6 grandchildren as the reason for his fear.
Just saying it out loud like that.
That admission of familial fear right there on the public record, it signaled the message had been received loud and clear. Challenge the ultimate authority, and the cost isn't just your business, it's potentially your physical safety, your family's security. And what happened to Volsky? He was promptly replaced as head of the union, cementing the state's victory in that battle for sort of psychological dominance.
So after that really brutal, very public demonstration with Yukos, the state didn't actually go for full, wholesale renationalization across the board, did it?
No, and that's the subtlety of the strategy that followed. Instead of trying to swallow everything whole, which can be inefficient, they began a more strategic consolidation of power. They used the Yukos affair as a kind of model for steady encroachment.
How did that work?
The state created these giant state corporations. Think Rosneft in oil, United Aircraft Corporation in aerospace. They were designed specifically to consolidate entire strategic sectors. And crucially, they put loyal allies, powerful figures from the security services often, in command. People like Igor Sechin at Rosneft, Sergei Ivanov at UAC.
And these weren't just CEO roles.
No. The sources emphasize these appointees used their corporate positions for essential political patronage. They handed out contracts, jobs, favors, effectively merging the political control structure with the crucial output of these key industries. By 2006, the sources indicate that the revenue generated just by these state-controlled companies accounted for something like 1/5 of Russia's entire GDP.
Wow, 1/5. So placing the core economy firmly back under the control of politically loyal figures.
Exactly. Steady encroachment, sector by sector.
Now, when we look at these really extreme examples, the asset seizures in Russia, those conditional regulatory waivers in Hong Kong, It might be tempting to think, okay, this is strictly an authoritarian thing. But the sources do remind us that even Western governments use economic dominance to enforce policy globally. The mechanism is just different, maybe less overtly brutal.
That's a really important point for perspective, yeah. The sources show this global pushback against unchecked financial power, but it operates differently, often through enormous financial penalties backed by Western rule of law. Look at the U.S. government forcing major international banks, BNP Paribas, HSBC, Credit Suisse, are mentioned to pay billions, literally billions, for offenses like money laundering or helping wealthy clients dodge taxes.
So private financial power is still subservient to state enforcement, even in the West.
Absolutely. It just happens through the legal and regulatory system with massive fines as the weapon of choice rather than, seizing the company outright before a conviction.
And that regulatory scope seems to be expanding too.
It does. The sources point specifically to the commodity trading industry. These are firms historically quite willing to do business with what the sources call unloved regimes. They're increasingly finding themselves in Washington sites. The U.S. is signaling less tolerance for traders whose business activities undermine stated foreign policy goals.
So making them potentially the next targets for major regulatory enforcement actions or fines?
It looks that way. The underlying principle seems consistent. Private economic power ultimately cannot be allowed to fundamentally conflict with core state strategy or interests. The big difference is the consequence of that conflict. In the West, it's usually gigantic fines, legal battles, maybe jail time for individuals. The system is designed, ideally, to absorb that shock. In the conditional wealth model we're discussing, the consequence can be immediate, existential. State absorption, political annihilation, enforced silence.
That is a very stark comparison, yeah? Hashtag tag 3. Ego, public stature, and the collision with control. So often, the friction point in these conditional relationships seems to boil down to personality, doesn't it? The personality of the billionaire themselves. Maybe it's the sheer confidence or sometimes just pure ego born from the spectacular success that convinces them they can operate outside these unwritten rules.
Yeah, I think that's often true. And you see that massive confidence even in the West, right? Expressed as a willingness to openly flout rules, maybe because the company's private or because they have this deep conviction that they're acting on principle. Steve Jobs, for instance, some on the Apple board apparently saw him as, quote, a petulant brat who just refused to play humble, even when it might have been strategically wise.
Right. He felt Apple was a company of principle and wouldn't compromise. And similarly, we see Elon Musk's approach, particularly with SpaceX being private. The sources mention him in moments of frustration, impulsively ordering the cancellation of major Falcon Heavy contracts. It demonstrates that feeling of being empowered to flout rules. He even famously stated, "I am wired for war."
That's a very telling quote, isn't it? Wired for war. And then you have ambition that goes beyond just business success into something. Well, almost like global delusion. Adam Newman at WeWork is the example used. His ego apparently translated into these sprawling, almost non-commercial ambitions. He reportedly wanted the biggest valuation possible so that, quote, when countries started shooting at one another, he'd be the one they'd have to call to solve their problem.
Right. That level of perceived self-importance, imagining yourself as a global arbiter between nations, that's inevitably going to clash with actual state authority, isn't it?
Absolutely. It fundamentally misunderstands the power dynamic.
So, if the issue is visibility, and maybe being perceived as a rival power center, what did some of the older, maybe more successful, long-lasting tycoons understand that perhaps some modern figures forget?
Tact, perhaps, and distance. Figures like J.D. Rockefeller Sr., the original oil baron. He focused intently on the business, on the finance, and actively avoided the public political fray. The sources note he maintained this kind of sanitary distance from what he called sordid municipal skirmishes. If conflict arose publicly, his strategy was apparently to profess ignorance of the whole matter. Keep your head down, basically.
He understood, it seems, that political longevity, especially when wielding immense economic power, required him to avoid direct public confrontations with state actors whenever possible.
Okay, but on the flip side, if you do become too famous, too much of a public figure, you risk inviting that direct political attention, even scrutiny. Our sources bring up William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate. He actively cultivated a public profile, built this image of himself as a knight on horseback, supposedly rescuing working people from the powerful trusts. Yeah, Hearst deliberately used his immense fame, which the sources say was based as much on rumor and self-promotion as reality, to assert direct political influence. It led to rivals denouncing him for, quote, arraying of class against class. He wasn't staying out of the skirmishes. He was jumping right into the political conversation, using his media empire as his weapon.
So the key difference, again, seems to be how the system deals with this inevitable clash, when individual ambition hits the structure of state power. In the West, the consequence of overreach or breaking the rules is primarily legal, right? We saw Evan Boyeski eventually cooperating with the SEC on insider trading. Or the more recent downfall of Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos. It results in financial collapse, huge fines, maybe prison time.
Exactly. The state absorbs that friction through its established legal and regulatory mechanisms. There's a process, however flawed it might sometimes be.
But in the conditional accommodation model we've been discussing, the consequence of going too far, of challenging the hand that feeds you, or getting too big for your britches politically, it's potentially state absorption, enforced silence, the kind of existential threat demonstrated so clearly by Khodorkovsky.
That seems to be the core distinction. Across all these systems, yes, the individual entrepreneur's ambition eventually bumps up against the structural power of the state. That seems inevitable.
But the fundamental difference is whether that clash results in, say, a legal battle over market share and maybe criminal charges, or a political battle for your very survival, for your freedom, for your company's existence.
A much higher stakes game. Hashtag Taxonodia, synthesis, and final thought. So, if we try to pull it all together, the common thread running through basically every one of our sources is this profound contingency of massive transformative wealth. The success of these really large-scale disruptive businesses, whether you're talking about the railroad monopolies back in the 19th century or the tech giants dominating the 21st, it's always enabled by and therefore ultimately dependent upon the prevailing political and regulatory environment. It just is.
Yeah, you can see that really clearly in how conflicts play out. In Western markets, you see companies fighting tooth and nail, often in court, over things like patent law or corporate raiding tactics, accusations of monopoly power. Amazon being accused of exploiting patent law to stifle competitors, or those huge dramatic takeover battles for firms like RJR Nabisco back in the day. The battles are mostly about capital control, market share, shareholder value.
Right. But in authoritarian states or these conditionally regulated systems we've looked at, the ultimate fight often isn't really for capital control in the same way. It's for political survival. It's about maintaining favor. The pattern seems unambiguous, especially when you look across Eurasia. Billionaires can thrive, build incredible things, live spectacular lives, but only as long as they deeply internalize and respect that the ultimate authority of the state is absolute. The lesson taught through that violent consolidation we saw in Russia with Yukos, it serves as this chilling, definitive warning to any ambitious figure anywhere who might mistake their government-enabled financial success for truly independent political power.
It's a dangerous mistake to make in those systems.
A potentially fatal one, professionally or even literally.
And if we connect this to this sort of bigger global picture, the financial balance of power, it's always shifting, isn't it? Our sources actually reminded us that over a century ago, the big American financiers, the Morgans and their like, they were seen by the established British financial aristocracy as this incoming barbarian horde.
Yeah, overtaking British finance, forcing a new set of rules, a new center of gravity.
So is something similar happening now, perhaps?
Well, we are certainly witnessing a shift, maybe a more profound one. The rise of these incredibly powerful, state-accommodated Asian giants, particularly in tech, coupled with the forceful, unambiguous demonstration of ultimate political authority, again, exemplified by the Khodorkovsky case, but echoed elsewhere, it really suggests a new set of global rules might be emerging or solidifying.
Rules where corporate power is maybe secondary?
Increasingly, yes. In these emerging systems, it seems corporate power is being more explicitly subsumed by state interests. Private capital acts almost as a construction mechanism for national political and strategic goals rather than an independent force.
That is a really sobering realization, isn't it? About the true hierarchy of control in a very large and growing swath of the global economy.
It certainly challenges some Western assumptions about the relationship between capital and state.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into these stark, sometimes frankly terrifying lessons of conditional wealth and absolute power.
Glad we could unpack it.
As we conclude, let's leave you, our listener, with this final provocative thought to chew on. Our sources reveal quite clearly that private capital is being actively leveraged right now to build the essential power grids for the coming AI age, often with direct government subsidies and mandates in strategically powerful nations like China. So this raises a really critical question for the future, doesn't it? In a world where vast technological power and the wealth that comes with it is generated through this kind of state accommodation, where does the ultimate authority really lie? Is it found in the brilliance of the innovation itself? Or is it found in the politics that ultimately chooses which innovators are allowed to survive, to thrive, and ultimately to control that critical infrastructure? That's something for you to mull over or maybe explore on your own. Thanks for listening.